They didn't know I was the majority shareholder who'd funded his startup from the beginning. I watched their faces transform when I finally revealed who really owned Horizon Dynamics. For years, I'd let my husband Gregory present me as his decorative, note-taking wife while he took credit for my business strategy. I maintained perfect composure as Gregory introduced me to the packed boardroom at Horizon Dynamics headquarters in downtown Boston. 12 executives in tailored suits barely glanced up from their leather portfolios as I entered. The morning sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the sleek glass table where they sat, while a smaller chair waited for me in the corner. "Gentlemen, this is Elise, my wife," Gregory announced with practiced charm. "She'll be sitting in today to take some notes for my personal records. Board procedures, you know, helps me remember the little details." His condescending tone made my skin crawl as several members nodded with patronizing smiles. I noticed 2 female executives exchange glances but remain silent. "Thank you for having me," I replied softly, playing my well-rehearsed role as I clutched my Mont Blanc portfolio, a perfect match to the one Gregory carried, though he never noticed such details. I took my designated seat in the corner, not at the gleaming mahogany table that dominated the room. The irony was exquisite. The company logo displayed prominently on their meeting materials, Horizon Dynamics, was named after my grandfather's coastal estate in Maine, where I'd first drafted the business plan 7 years ago. Even the stylized H in the logo had been sketched by my hand during a weekend retreat when Gregory and I were still equals. The initial $40 million in capital had come from my family's investment fund, carefully channeled through a network of holding companies that obscured the true ownership from everyone except my 3 most trusted advisors. "Let's review last quarter's performance," Gregory continued, adjusting his custom Brioni tie, a $600 birthday gift I'd purchased just last month from Neiman Marcus. "As you can see from the quarterly report, my strategic pivot into precision medical technology has paid off handsomely. Revenue up 32% year over year." My strategic pivot. The research partnership with Geneva University Medical Center had been my suggestion during a dinner in our Beacon Hill home last winter, leveraging connections I'd built during my 9 years in biotech venture capital at Wellington Partners, a distinguished career I'd stepped back from after marrying Gregory. He'd presented it as his own brilliant insight at the following week's executive retreat. Samuel Whitfield, the silver-haired CFO who'd known Gregory since their Harvard business school days, nodded appreciatively. "The board is extremely pleased with your leadership, Gregory. The acquisition of Medinova was particularly impressive, getting them for 12% below market valuation while keeping their R&D team intact. Masterful negotiation. If only they knew that acquisition had been orchestrated through my former roommate Victoria Chen at Blackstone Capital, who still owed me a favor from when I backed her first fund during our Stanford days. I'd spent 3 months structuring the deal, creating financial models until 2 a.m., while Gregory was busy cultivating his public image at industry panels where he was inevitably introduced as a visionary CEO. "We're projected to break $750 million in revenue next fiscal year," Gregory announced with practiced humility that I knew masked his boundless pride. "The growth trajectory in our cardiac monitoring division is exceeding even my ambitious expectations." "Elise, be sure you're getting all this down," Gregory called out suddenly, not bothering to turn in my direction. "The numbers are rather complex. Perhaps note that cardiac monitoring showed 18% growth, exceeding projections by 4 points." Several board members chuckled indulgently. Richard Bennett, who handled Asian market expansion, actually winked at me as if I were a child being given simple arithmetic. I noticed Alexander Hamilton, the newest board member who'd only joined 6 weeks ago from Peterson Healthcare, glance at me with slight discomfort. He didn't yet share the other's dismissive attitude. He hadn't been fully acculturated to Gregory's carefully constructed hierarchy. "Of course, dear," I replied with a practiced smile. jotting nonsense on my notepad while mentally calculating that the actual cardiac monitoring growth was closer to 16.8% when adjusted for the one-time licensing payment from Tokyo General. Inside, I was reviewing the quarterly projections, immediately spotting 3 analytical errors in their 5-year growth forecast. The international expansion model completely overlooked regulatory hurdles in European markets that would delay approval by at least 18 months. I'd built Wellington Bioinvestment Partners from scratch at 28, growing it from $20 million to over $2.7 billion before my 35th birthday. My fund had backed 6 successful medical device IPOs and completed 15 profitable exits. When I met Gregory at the Massachusetts General Hospital Charity Gala 6 years ago, he'd been a promising executive with ambitious ideas, but limited capital and connections. I saw potential in both the man and his vision for revolutionizing medical technology through AI-enhanced diagnostics. Back then, he'd valued my expertise, spending nights in our Cambridge apartment discussing market strategy and innovation pipelines. The walls would be covered with whiteboards filled with our collaborative ideas. But as Horizon Dynamics grew from a 12-person startup to a 600-employee industry disruptor, so did Gregory's ego and public persona. My role shifted from true partner to decorative prop, my substantive input relegated to private conversations that he would later present as his own insights in boardrooms exactly like this one. Our biggest challenge remains the Jensen patent portfolio, Gregory continued, his tone growing serious as he referred to a crucial collection of intellectual property owned by our chief competitor. Their neural interface technology is currently blocking our expansion into advanced neurological applications. Without a solution, we're effectively locked out of an $8 billion market segment. I suppressed a small smile behind my notebook. The Jensen patent portfolio had been the subject of our heated argument last night in our Beacon Hill brownstone, the final straw that had triggered my decision to end this charade once and for all. What Gregory didn't know was that my family office had quietly acquired a controlling interest in Jensen Biomedical 3 months ago, through a complex transaction involving 3 shell companies, after I'd recognized its strategic importance to our future. The paperwork finalizing our ownership had been signed yesterday at 4:17 p.m. We've explored every angle to work around these patents, Samuel added, pushing his tortoiseshell glasses higher on his nose as he flipped through a detailed legal brief. But counsel confirms we'd be risking significant infringement claims. We either need to license the technology, which Jensen has flatly refused to consider, or delay our neurology platform by 18 months minimum for a complete redesign. Gregory shook his head dramatically, placing both palms on the table as he leaned forward with practiced intensity. Neither option is acceptable to me or our shareholders. This company has never backed down from a challenge, and we won't start. Now, that's not how I built Horizon Dynamics into what it is today. How he built Horizon Dynamics. My Mont Blanc pen creased the paper as my grip tightened involuntarily. Perhaps your wife has a suggestion? Alexander said unexpectedly, looking toward me with what seemed like genuine curiosity. Didn't you mention at the reception last month that Elise had some experience in the biotech sector, Gregory? The room fell awkwardly silent. Gregory's expression flickered between surprise and annoyance before settling into amused condescension, an expression I'd grown increasingly familiar with over the past 2 years. That's thoughtful, Alexander, but Elise's experience was quite limited, he replied smoothly. Mostly administrative work at a small investment fund before we met. He chuckled warmly, inviting others to join his gentle dismissal. She's much better at organizing our social calendar than navigating the complexities of patent law and medical device regulations. Aren't you, darling? Several board members smiled indulgently. I saw recognition dawn in Alexander's eyes, not of my accomplishments, but of the unwritten rule that the CEO's wife wasn't to be taken seriously, regardless of her background. He'd just learned an important lesson about the culture Gregory had cultivated. Actually, I said, closing my notebook with deliberate calm as I placed it on my lap. "I might have some thoughts on the Jensen situation that could prove useful." "Actually," I said, closing my notebook with deliberate calm as I placed it on my lap, "I might have some thoughts on the Jensen situation that could prove useful." The boardroom temperature seemed to drop several degrees. 12 pairs of eyes turned toward me with expressions ranging from mild amusement to outright dismissal. Gregory's practiced smile faltered for just a moment before recovering its confident gleam. "That's sweet, darling," he replied, with the indulgent tone he reserved for when I spoke about business matters in public. "But we've had our legal team and 3 separate patent attorneys review the situation exhaustively. It's quite technical." Samuel Whitfield cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should continue with the established agenda, Gregory. The R&D budget allocation requires board approval today." I remained perfectly still, maintaining eye contact with Gregory. After 6 years of marriage, he recognized the subtle shift in my demeanor, the slight straightening of my posture, the cool assessment in my gaze. It was the same look I'd given him last night when he'd dismissed my concerns about the Jensen patents over dinner. "What exactly did you have in mind, Mrs. Harrington?" Alexander Hamilton asked, either missing or deliberately ignoring the social cues from the rest of the board. His Australian accent stood out among the predominantly East Coast voices around the table. Gregory laughed lightly, running a hand through his expertly trimmed salt and pepper hair. "Alex, I appreciate your inclusiveness, but we really should. I believe we could explore a third option beyond licensing or redesign," I interrupted, my voice quiet but firm. The room fell silent. I had never interrupted Gregory in a professional setting before. Perhaps a strategic acquisition would be more efficient. Richard Bennett, head of Asian market expansion, couldn't suppress a condescending smile. "With all due respect, Mrs. Harrington, Jensen Biomedical is valued at approximately $2.4 billion. Their board has repeatedly rebuffed acquisition attempts from companies much larger than Horizon. The regulatory hurdles alone would be insurmountable, not to mention the capital requirements." I nodded thoughtfully, as though considering this perspective for the first time. "You're absolutely right about their public valuation, Mr. Bennett. Though I believe the actual value when accounting for their debt structure and R&D pipeline inefficiencies is closer to $1.9 billion, still substantial, of course." A flicker of surprise crossed Richard's face before he masked it. Gregory's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Only I would notice the slight tension in the corner of his mouth. He knew I couldn't have gleaned those specific figures from casual conversation. "Elise," Gregory said, his voice carrying a warning note that the others might miss. "Perhaps we should discuss your ideas privately after the meeting. The board has a full agenda to cover." I smiled pleasantly. "Of course, though since we're already discussing the Jensen patents, it might be efficient to mention that their controlling shareholder might be more amenable to a conversation than the board realizes." "Their controlling shareholder is Arthur Jensen himself," Samuel interjected, his tone making it clear he was correcting an obvious misunderstanding. "He founded the company 20 years ago and maintains 53% ownership through his family trust. He's notorious for refusing to even discuss acquisition offers." 53% as of last quarter's SEC filings, I acknowledged with a small nod. Though ownership structures can change rather quickly when conducted through private transactions, particularly when managed through entities registered in Singapore, Luxembourg, and the Cayman Islands. A heavy silence fell over the boardroom. Gregory's expression darkened as he recognized the specific jurisdictions where my family office conducted its most confidential transactions. I watched the calculating look in his eyes. He was rapidly reassessing what I might know and how I might know it. "How exactly would you be aware of Jensen's private ownership changes?" asked Catherine Reynolds, head of regulatory affairs. She'd been largely silent throughout the meeting, but now leaned forward with genuine curiosity. As one of only 2 women on the executive team, She'd always maintained a professional distance from me at company functions, perhaps to reinforce her own hard-earned position at the table. I maintained my composed smile. I'd try to keep informed about industry developments, old habits from my previous career. Gregory laughed a bit too forcefully, attempting to reclaim control of the conversation. Elise occasionally reads the Wall Street Journal, though I think she primarily follows the lifestyle section. He turned to address the room. Let's table this discussion and proceed with, is there something specific you know about Jensen Biomedical that we should be aware of, Mrs. Harrington? Alexander pressed, ignoring Gregory's attempt to change the subject. I reached into my portfolio and removed a single sheet of paper, placing it carefully on my lap. I believe Jensen might be receptive to overtures from Horizon Dynamics under the right circumstances, particularly if approached with a specific integration strategy that protects their core research team while leveraging Horizon's superior commercialization infrastructure. Gregory's expression shifted from dismissive to concerned. The specific business terminology I'd used was precisely how he'd described our company's strengths during his CNBC interview last month. Elise, he said, his voice lower now. This really isn't the appropriate forum for speculation. It's not speculation, I replied calmly, unfolding the document in my lap. As of yesterday afternoon, the controlling interest in Jensen Biomedical was acquired by Lighthouse Capital Partners through a private transaction with Arthur Jensen's family trust. The deal closed at 4:17 p.m. Eastern Time. The CFO's eyebrows shot up. That's not possible. We monitor all significant ownership changes in our competitive set. Nothing has been reported to the SEC. The disclosure filing period allows for a 5-business-day window, Catherine noted, her legal background surfacing. If such a transaction occurred yesterday, it wouldn't appear in public records yet. I nodded appreciatively at Catherine. Exactly right. The paperwork will be filed with the SEC by close of business tomorrow, as required by law. Gregory stared at me, his confident facade cracking further. How could you possibly know this? Because I authorized the transaction, I replied simply. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the usual background hum of the building's ventilation system seemed to have paused in anticipation. You... what? Gregory finally managed. Lighthouse Capital Partners is a subsidiary of Waverly Family Holdings, I explained, my voice steady and professional. Waverly is the private investment office that provided the initial $40 million in funding for Horizon Dynamics 7 years. Ego. I watched the information ripple through the room. The board members exchanged confused glances, trying to process this unexpected revelation. That's not, Gregory began, then stopped abruptly. The initial funding came through Atlantic Venture Partners. Atlantic Venture Partners is a shell company wholly owned by Waverly, I corrected gently, as is Meridian Capital, which provided the Series B funding, and Oakshore Investments, which underwrote the mezzanine financing before our last capital raise. Samuel Whitfield's financial mind was clearly racing ahead of the others. Are you suggesting that all of our major funding rounds came from the same source? That's over $120 million in total investment. $127.4 million to be precise, I confirmed. Structured through different entities for regulatory compliance and strategic reasons. And you're claiming to have insider knowledge of these investments? Richard asked skeptically. Not insider knowledge, I clarified. Direct authority. I've been the managing director of Waverly Family Holdings since founding it 11 years ago. Before that, I was a general partner at Wellington Bio Investment Partners, where I managed a $2.7 billion portfolio focused on medical technology investments. The shock on their faces might have been comical under different circumstances. Gregory had gone pale, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests of his chair. That's absurd, he finally said, though his voice lacked conviction. You worked in some administrative role at a small fund. You've never mentioned anything about I never corrected your assumptions, I interrupted softly. There seemed little point once it became clear you preferred introducing me as just your wife, rather than acknowledging my professional background. Catherine Reynolds was typing rapidly on her tablet. After a moment, she looked up with widened eyes. Elise, Waverly Harrington, founder of Wellington Bioinvestment Partners, named to Forbes 40 Under 40 in 2015, recipient of the Venture Capital Leadership Award in 2017. She looked up at me with new understanding. You stepped back from public investments around the time you married Gregory. I nodded once, acknowledging the accurate summary. This is ridiculous, Gregory insisted, though his voice had lost its authoritative edge. If this were true, why would you have kept it secret all this time? Why pretend to be... He trailed off. Just your wife? I finished for him. Initially, it wasn't intentional. When we met, you seemed to appreciate my business acumen. But as Horizon grew, you became increasingly comfortable presenting my ideas as your own. Rather than create conflict, I allowed it. Perhaps that was my mistake. Alexander Hamilton was looking at me with newfound respect. So Waverly Holdings now controls both Horizon Dynamics and Jensen Biomedical? Waverly has been the majority shareholder of Horizon since its founding, I confirmed. As of yesterday, we also control 61% of Jensen. The acquisition was completed at a 15% discount to market value due to certain leverage points we had identified in their capital structure. Samuel Whitfield removed his glasses and massaged the bridge of his nose. If what you're saying is true, and that remains to be verified, what exactly are you proposing? I finally stood, walking calmly to the head of the table opposite Gregory. I placed the document I'd been holding onto the polished mahogany surface. This is a memorandum from Waverly Holdings outlining the proposed merger of Jensen Biomedical's patent portfolio and R&D team into Horizon Dynamics operations. The combined entity would control approximately 68% of the neurological monitoring intellectual property space, creating a near-insurmountable competitive advantage. The merger would be structured as a stock transaction to maximize tax efficiency. The board members stared at the document, none making a move to touch it. You're seriously claiming to control this company? Richard finally asked, looking between Gregory and me with naked disbelief. I own 74% of Horizon Dynamics voting shares, I stated matter-of-factly. The remaining 26% is distributed among various institutional investors and your executive stock option program. Gregory's ownership stake is approximately 7%, the majority of which came as stock-based compensation that I approved as the controlling shareholder. Gregory's face had transitioned from shock to simmering anger. This is some kind of elaborate joke, or worse, a bizarre power play. Elise, whatever you're trying to accomplish here, perhaps we should verify Mrs. Harrington's claims before proceeding further, Alexander suggested diplomatically. If what she's saying is accurate, it fundamentally changes the dynamics of our discussion about Jensen Biomedical. A simple call to our corporate counsel will confirm the ownership structure, Catherine added. Davis Hamilton should have those records readily available. By all means, I agreed, gesturing toward the speakerphone in the center of the conference table. Though I should mention that Davis Hamilton reports directly to Waverly's legal team on matters of corporate governance. That reporting structure was established in the original incorporation documents. Samuel reached for the phone but hesitated, looking to Gregory for permission, a habit formed over years of deferring to his authority. Gregory sat frozen, his expression unreadable as the carefully constructed reality he'd presented to his board for years began to unravel. The morning sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows illuminated dust particles dancing in the air, the only movement in a room that had become utterly still. The psychological weight of what was happening seemed to press against everyone present. Years of corporate hierarchy, carefully cultivated relationships, and established power dynamics were shifting before their eyes. I remembered the charity gala where I'd first met Gregory 6 years ago. He'd been charming, ambitious, and genuinely interested in my thoughts about emerging medical technologies. In those early days, he'd valued my expertise, spending evenings discussing strategic opportunities while we shared takeout in my Beacon Hill apartment. The shift had been gradual, so subtle that I barely noticed it happening. The first time he introduced me as my wife Elise, she used to work in finance, at an industry function where 3 people knew me professionally. The careful reframing of my suggestions as his own insights in executive meetings. The increasing frequency with which he'd dismiss my concerns about company direction with, "You don't understand the complexities involved." Last night had been the breaking point. Over dinner at L'Espalier, I'd mentioned my concerns about the Jensen patent situation. His response, delivered with patronizing patience while refilling my wine glass, had been illuminating. "Sweetheart, I appreciate your interest in my work, but this involves sophisticated corporate strategy that you couldn't possibly understand. Why don't you focus on planning that charity luncheon instead? That's much more your speed." After 6 years of calculated diminishment, something inside me had finally snapped. The documents authorizing the Jensen acquisition had been prepared. Weeks earlier, I'd simply been waiting for the right moment to execute. His dismissal provided the perfect catalyst. Now, watching Gregory struggle to process the revelation that his professionally invisible wife was actually his boss, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Vindication, certainly, but also sadness for what our relationship had become, and determination to restore my rightful place in the company I'd built. Samuel's hand finally moved toward the speakerphone, breaking the spell that had fallen over the room. The verification of my claims was about to begin, and with it, the irrevocable transformation of everything Gregory had believed about his company, his success, and his marriage. Samuel's hand hovered over the speakerphone for several uncomfortable seconds before Gregory finally gave a curt nod. The CFO punched in the number for Davis Hamilton, the corporate counsel who had handled Horizon's legal affairs since its founding. The room remained utterly silent as the phone rang 3 times before a crisp female voice answered. Davis Hamilton's office. "Barbara, it's Samuel Whitfield. I need to speak with Davis immediately regarding an urgent matter of corporate governance." "One moment, Mr. Whitfield." The tension in the boardroom was palpable as classical hold music played softly through the speaker. Catherine Reynolds continued researching on her tablet, occasionally glancing up at me with a mixture of professional curiosity and newfound respect. Richard Bennett drummed his fingers nervously on the table while Alexander Hamilton studied my face intently. Gregory stared fixedly at the speakerphone, his jaw working silently as though rehearsing what he would say. I remained standing at the opposite end of the table, perfectly composed in my deliberately understated theory suit, a far cry from the designer clothes I wore when conducting business as managing director of Waverly Holdings. "Samuel Davis." "Hamilton speaking. What can I do for you?" The attorney's baritone voice filled the room. "Davis, I'm in the boardroom with the executive team and, Mrs. Harrington. We need immediate clarification on Horizon Dynamics' ownership structure." There was a brief pause. "I see. May I ask what prompted this inquiry?" Samuel glanced uncomfortably at Gregory before responding. "Mrs. Harrington has made certain claims about the company's controlling interest that we need to verify." "I understand," Davis replied, his tone shifting to a more formal register. "Before I proceed, I should confirm who is present in the room." Samuel listed off each board member and executive by name, finishing with, "and Gregory and Elise Harrington. Thank you. Given the nature of this inquiry, I need to verify that Mrs. Harrington has authorized this disclosure." All eyes turned to me. "I authorize full disclosure of Horizon Dynamics' ownership structure and my position within that structure," I stated clearly. "Voice confirmation received and logged." Davis responded. The controlling interest in Horizon Dynamics, representing 74% of voting shares, is held by Waverly Family Holdings through various subsidiary entities. The remaining shares are distributed among institutional investors and the employee stock option program. This ownership structure has been in place since the company's founding, with minor percentage adjustments following each funding round. The blood drained from Gregory's face as Davis continued. Waverly Family Holdings is wholly owned and managed by Elise Waverly Harrington, who serves as its managing director and sole principal. Mrs. Harrington has maintained ultimate controlling interest in Horizon Dynamics since its incorporation. Per the corporate governance documents, all major financing decisions, board appointments, and executive compensation packages require her approval, either directly or through her designated representatives. A stunned silence followed this confirmation. Samuel removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. And Gregory's position? Mr. Harrington holds approximately 7% of company shares, the majority granted through his executive compensation package. His appointment as CEO was approved by the board and ratified by Waverly Holdings in 2018. Thank you, Davis, I said before anyone else could speak. Could you also confirm the status of Jensen Biomedical's ownership as of yesterday? One moment, Davis replied. The sound of typing filtered through the speaker. Yes, our records show that as of 4:17 p.m. Eastern Time yesterday, Lighthouse Capital, a subsidiary of Waverly Holdings, completed acquisition of 61% controlling interest in Jensen Biomedical through a private transaction with the Jensen Family Trust. The SEC filing is being processed today and will be public by tomorrow. That will be all, Davis. Thank you, I said firmly. Of course, Mrs. Harrington. Will there be anything else? Not at this time. The call ended, leaving the boardroom in shocked silence. For several seconds, no one moved. Then Catherine Reynolds set down her tablet with deliberate care. Well, she said, breaking the silence, it appears Mrs. Harrington's statements are accurate. The question now is where we go from here. Gregory surged to his feet, his face flushed with a volatile mixture of embarrassment and rage. This is absurd. Some kind of elaborate deception. I built this company from nothing. You built it with my capital, my connections, and frequently my ideas, I interjected calmly. I don't dispute that you've worked extremely hard, Gregory. Your operational execution has been generally excellent, but let's not rewrite history in this room. Why? He demanded, his voice shaking slightly. Why maintain this charade for years? Watching me take credit? Letting me believe? He stopped abruptly, perhaps realizing how damning his own words sounded. Initially, it wasn't a charade at all, I explained, addressing the entire room rather than just Gregory. When Horizon was founded, Gregory and I were true partners. I provided the capital and industry expertise. He brought operational experience and boundless drive. I preferred to remain a silent partner for various reasons, including ongoing commitments to other portfolio companies. I moved around the table slowly, continuing my explanation. As the company grew, our dynamic shifted. Gregory began introducing me as just his wife at industry functions where I'd previously done business as a respected investor. He started presenting my strategic suggestions as his own inspirations. Rather than create conflict in both our professional and personal relationship, I allowed this narrative to continue. Alexander Hamilton cleared his throat. With respect, Mrs. Harrington, that doesn't explain why you've chosen this particular moment to reveal yourself. 2 reasons, I replied. First, the Jensen patent situation represents an existential threat to Horizon's growth trajectory. The solution required my direct intervention as the controlling shareholder of both companies. I glanced at Gregory, whose anger had calcified into a rigid mask. Second, last night Gregory informed me that my amateur meddling in company strategy was becoming problematic. He suggested I focus on more appropriate activities given my limited business background. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. That was a private conversation, Gregory said stiffly. Yes, it was, I acknowledged. But when it became clear that you genuinely believed your own narrative, that you'd built this company single-handedly, and that my input was unwelcome interference, I realized the situation had become untenable. Samuel Whitfield, ever the pragmatist, tapped his pen thoughtfully against his legal pad. Regardless of how we arrived at this point, we need to address the immediate implications. You now control both Horizon Dynamics and Jensen Biomedical. What exactly are you proposing? I gestured to the document still lying untouched in the center of the table. The memorandum outlines a proposed merger that would consolidate Jensen's intellectual property portfolio within Horizon's operations. The combined entity would control the majority of patents in the neurological monitoring space, while eliminating our most significant competitor. Richard Bennett finally reached for the document, scanning it quickly. This is remarkably comprehensive. The proposed structure addresses regulatory concerns I would have expected to be obstacles. He looked up at me with newfound professional respect. You've clearly given this considerable thought. The integration plan has been in development for approximately 6 weeks, I confirmed, since it became clear that Jensen's technology would be crucial to our long-term growth. Catherine Reynolds had taken the document from Richard and was reviewing it with a lawyer's precision. The regulatory approach is sound. The proposed management structure, however, she glanced up, her eyes moving between Gregory and me. It doesn't specify who would lead the combined entity. All eyes returned to me. That brings us to the second purpose of this meeting, I said, maintaining my professional demeanor despite the emotional undercurrents swirling through the room. In addition to approving the merger, the board needs to consider leadership changes. Gregory's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table. You're forcing me out. Not necessarily, I replied evenly. But our current arrangement is clearly no longer viable. There are several options for restructuring leadership, outlined on page 7 of the memorandum. Alexander Hamilton flipped to the relevant section, his eyebrows rising as he read. You're suggesting either a co-CEO structure, with you and Gregory sharing responsibilities based on your respective strengths, or... He looked up, his expression carefully neutral. Or Gregory transitions to chairman while you assume the CEO role. Those are the two most viable options, I confirmed, though the board is welcome to propose alternatives. This is a coup, Gregory stated flatly, looking around the table for support. After years of successful leadership, during which we've grown from a startup to a $900 million company, my wife is using her hidden financial leverage to seize control. Your wife, I corrected quietly, is the founder and controlling shareholder exercising her fiduciary responsibility to ensure optimal leadership for the next phase of growth. The same founder who approved your compensation package worth $37 million over the past 5 years. Samuel Whitfield, ever attuned to financial implications, looked up sharply. What happens to the stock price if this becomes public? The market doesn't respond well to leadership disputes. A fair concern, I acknowledged. Which is why I've prepared 3 different communication strategies, depending on which leadership structure the board recommends. I removed another document from my portfolio and placed it beside the first. Each approach emphasizes the strategic benefits of the Jensen acquisition while presenting leadership changes as a natural evolution for the expanding organization. Catherine Reynolds reviewed the communications document with obvious professional appreciation. This anticipates major investor questions and outlines a clear 90-day transition plan regardless of which option is selected. She looked up at me with newfound professional respect. You've been preparing this for some time. Since Gregory made it clear that he no longer valued my input, I confirmed. Though I've maintained contingency planning throughout my involvement with Horizon, as I do with all major investments. Gregory pushed away from the table abruptly, pacing toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. The Boston skyline spread out behind him, a backdrop that had featured in numerous executive profiles celebrating his visionary leadership. When he turned back, his expression had shifted from anger to calculation. "Let's be practical," he said, his business instincts reasserting themselves. "A public dispute benefits nobody. The Jensen acquisition is clearly advantageous. So let's discuss these leadership options rationally." He was adapting rapidly, looking for leverage, a quality that had made him an effective CEO. I'd always admired his strategic flexibility, even when it frustrated me personally. "I agree," I replied. "My preference is the co-CEO model. Your operational expertise combined with my strategic and financial background would provide a balanced leadership approach that the market would respond to positively." "And our marriage?" he asked, his voice lower now, meant primarily for me despite our audience. "That's a separate discussion," I replied evenly. "One we'll have privately, regardless of what the board decides." Alexander Hamilton glanced between us, then addressed the room. "I suggest we take a brief recess to review these documents thoroughly before discussing the options. Perhaps 30 minutes? "A reasonable suggestion," I agreed. Though I should note that timing is somewhat critical. The Jensen acquisition will become public knowledge tomorrow, and we should be prepared with our integration announcement. Samuel nodded. 30 minutes, then we reconvened to discuss. As the board members stood, gathering their materials and digesting the morning's revelations, Gregory approached me directly for the first time since my disclosure. "You've been planning this for months," he said quietly, anger simmering beneath his controlled exterior. "All those nights you spent reading in your study? You were orchestrating this takeover." "Not a takeover, Gregory," I corrected him. "A correction? And yes, once it became clear that you truly believed I was just your wife, with nothing valuable to contribute, I began planning for this eventuality." His eyes narrowed. "You could have simply told me the truth." "Would you have believed me?" I asked simply. "Or would you have dismissed it as another example of your wife overestimating her capabilities?" Before he could respond, Catherine Reynolds approached us, tablet in hand. "Mrs. Harrington, I've pulled the latest market analyses on both companies. If you have a moment, I'd like to discuss potential valuation impacts of the merger announcement." "Of course, Catherine," I replied, deliberately using her first name as a professional equal for the first time. "Let's use the small conference room across the hall." As I turned to follow her, I caught Alexander Hamilton watching the interaction with thoughtful interest. The power dynamics in the room had shifted irrevocably, and everyone was recalibrating. Everyone except Gregory, who remained rooted in place, staring at the chair in the corner where just his wife had sat, taking notes just 40 minutes earlier. The small conference room across from the main boardroom became a temporary command center during the 30-minute recess. Catherine Reynolds and I reviewed market projections while Alexander Hamilton joined us with questions about integration timelines. Samuel Whitfield had sequestered himself in his office, presumably verifying my claims, while Richard Bennett was spotted making hushed phone calls in the hallway. Gregory had disappeared entirely. "These synergy projections are remarkably detailed," Catherine observed, scanning the financial models I'd shared. "You've mapped integration points down to the department level. Jensen's neural interface researchers paired with our commercialization specialists should accelerate time to market by approximately 14 months, I confirmed. Alexander studied the document thoughtfully. "The market will respond positively to this merger, but they'll have questions about the leadership situation." My phone vibrated with a text from Victoria Chen at Blackstone. "Word's getting out. 3 analysts asking about unusual options activity in Jensen stock. Timeline accelerating?" I frowned. Slightly. "We may need to move more quickly than planned. Market chatter about Jensen is already increasing." Catherine checked her watch. "The 30 minutes are nearly up anyway. Shall we head back?" As we gathered our materials, Alexander cleared his throat. Mrs. Harrington, or should I say Ms. Waverly, how did you maintain your dual identity for so long? Surely people from your venture capital days would have recognized you. I smiled slightly. Several factors worked in my favor. The venture capital, world and corporate operations occupied different spheres. I deliberately maintained a low public profile during my Wellington days. Very few photos, limited speaking engagements. And, Catherine added perceptively, people see what they expect to see. Once Gregory established you as just his wife, few would look past that label. We returned to find most board members reassembled. Gregory had returned as well, freshly, composed with a pragmatic air. The slight redness around his eyes suggested an emotional moment had occurred in private, but his expression was now carefully neutral. Samuel Whitfield nodded to me. I've verified everything independently. The ownership structures are exactly as you described. The Jensen acquisition is legitimate. Before we begin formal discussions, I said, taking a seat at the table rather than returning to my corner chair, I want to acknowledge that this morning's revelations have been disruptive. That wasn't my intention. My goal has always been Horizon's long-term success. Gregory cleared his throat. While I obviously have personal feelings about how this situation has unfolded, I agree that the company's interests must take precedence. The Jensen acquisition represents a tremendous opportunity we cannot squander with internal discord. His professional response surprised me slightly. I'd expected more resistance. I've reviewed both proposed options, Catherine said, tapping the memorandum. From a market perception standpoint, the co-CEO model presents some communications challenges but offers leadership, continuity. The chairman, CEO alternative provides clearer operational authority but might be more disruptive. Alexander leaned forward. The co-CEO model works when individuals have clearly delineated responsibilities leveraging distinct skills. Gregory's operational focus paired with Elise's strategic vision could be complementary. Richard Bennett finally spoke up. Let's address the elephant in the room. You two are married. How does that factor into either leadership scenario, particularly given today's revelations? Gregory and I exchanged a look, the first moment of genuine communication between us since the meeting began. Our personal relationship is obviously complicated at the moment, I acknowledged. However, we've both demonstrated the ability to compartmentalize personal and professional matters. Gregory nodded stiffly. Whatever personal reckoning awaits us, the company shouldn't suffer for it. While I appreciate that sentiment, Samuel said, practical concerns remain. Strategic disagreements between married co-CEOs could paralyze decision-making. A valid concern, I conceded, which is why the governance structure outlined in Section 3 includes a clearly defined dispute resolution framework, with the board serving as the ultimate arbiter for deadlocked decisions. Catherine looked up from that section. The framework is comprehensive, with escalation protocols and timelines. It's actually more robust than many co-CEO arrangements I've encountered. A knock at the boardroom door interrupted our discussion. Gregory's executive assistant Jennifer peered in apologetically. I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's an urgent matter requiring attention. Multiple financial news outlets are reporting unusual trading patterns in Jensen Biomedical stock. They're requesting comment regarding market rumors of a potential acquisition. The timing couldn't have been worse, or more perfect, depending on one's perspective. The controlled revelation I'd planned had just been accelerated by market forces, beyond anyone's control. How many inquiries? I asked, already reaching for my phone. 7 in the past 15 minutes. CNBC, Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, plus several industry publications. They're all asking specifically about Horizon's involvement. Gregory's expression tightened. Tell them we don't comment on market rumors or speculation. That won't work, I interjected, already typing a message to my communications team. A no-comment response will only fuel speculation and potentially trigger regulatory scrutiny. The board members exchanged concerned glances as the implications became clear. Whatever decision we made about leadership needed to happen immediately. The Jensen acquisition was about to become public knowledge whether we were prepared or not. "We need to make a decision now," Samuel stated, voicing what everyone was thinking. "The market opens in 20 minutes. If we don't control this narrative, it will control us." All eyes turned toward Gregory and me, the husband who had built his identity around being the visionary leader, and the wife who had just revealed herself as the true power behind the company. The next few minutes would determine not just the future of Horizon Dynamics, but the public story of our relationship that would inevitably become business school case study material for decades to come. "I need 2 minutes," I said decisively, standing up. "Then we'll announce our decision. Catherine, please draft holding statements to major outlets acknowledging discussions with Jensen but providing no specifics yet. Alexander, contact our investor relations team. They should prepare for an emergency call at noon." The executives moved with newfound deference to my authority, no longer looking to Gregory for confirmation. He noticed this subtle but profound shift, his jaw tightening, almost imperceptibly. "We should issue a joint statement," Gregory suggested, his operational instincts kicking in despite the personal earthquake he was experiencing. "Present whatever leadership structure we choose as a strategic evolution rather than a reactionary move." "Agreed," I replied, appreciating his professionalism despite everything. "Samuel, please prepare the board for an emergency vote in 5 minutes to formalize our decision." As the board members dispersed to handle their assigned tasks, I gestured for Gregory to join me by the windows overlooking Boston Harbor. For a moment, he hesitated, perhaps reluctant to appear as though following my directive. Then, with a resigned exhale, he crossed the room to stand beside me. 6 years, he said quietly, gazing out at the water rather than looking at me. 6 years of marriage, and I never knew who you really were. "That's not entirely true," I replied, keeping my voice low enough that others couldn't hear. "You knew exactly who I was in the beginning. You valued my business insights, sought my strategic input. It was only after Horizon started succeeding that you began introducing me as just your wife." His expression tightened. "You deliberately misled me." "Did I?" I countered. "Or did you simply stop seeing me as anything beyond an accessory to your success? When exactly did you decide that my suggestions were amateur meddling rather than the expertise of someone who managed billions in investments?" A flush crept up his neck. "You could have said something, corrected me. Would you have listened? Or would you have found it threatening to your carefully constructed narrative as the self-made visionary?" Gregory turned to face me directly. "What happens now? To the company? And to us?" The question hung between us, weighted with professional and personal implications. Through the glass walls, I could see the board members reassembling, their expressions tense with anticipation. Outside, Boston's financial district gleamed. In the morning sun, unaware that one of its fastest-growing companies was undergoing a seismic leadership shift. "Professionally, we have 2 viable options," I said, maintaining my composure. "The co-CEO model would leverage our complementary skills while signaling stability to the market. The chairman-CEO alternative provides clearer operational authority, but risks being perceived as more disruptive." "And personally?" he pressed. I met his gaze directly. "That depends on whether you can accept who I really am rather than who you've imagined me to be for the past 4 years." Before he could respond, Samuel approached us. "The financial press is getting aggressive. Bloomberg is reporting sources familiar with the matter, confirming acquisition talks. We need to issue a statement immediately." The moment of decision had arrived. Whatever personal reckoning awaited us would have to come later. Right now, Horizon Dynamics needed clear leadership and a unified front. "Gregory," I said quietly, "what's your recommendation?" It was a deliberate choice of words, acknowledging his expertise while asserting my authority to make the final decision. For a moment, something like respect flickered in his eyes, perhaps recognition that I was extending a professional courtesy he hadn't always granted me. "The co-CEO model," he answered after a brief hesitation. "It maintains continuity while allowing us to leverage the Jensen acquisition for maximum market impact. We present it as a strategic evolution planned for months, accelerated by today's acquisition opportunity." I nodded once. "I agree. Let's proceed." We returned to the table together, a united front despite the personal chasm that had opened between us. The executive team watched our approach with barely concealed curiosity about what had transpired in our private conversation. "We've reached a decision," I announced. "Effective immediately, Horizon Dynamics will implement a co-CEO leadership structure. Gregory will focus on operations and product development. I will oversee strategy, finance, and integration of the Jensen acquisition. The board will need to formalize this with a vote," Samuel noted, already distributing the necessary documentation. "Before we vote," I continued, "I want to be clear about immediate next steps. We will issue a joint press release within 30 minutes announcing both the Jensen acquisition and our new leadership structure. The narrative will present these changes as part of Horizon's planned expansion strategy, not as a reaction to today's events." Catherine Reynolds had already begun drafting the announcement on her tablet. "We should emphasize the complementary nature of your leadership roles and the strategic advantages of the combined entity." "Agreed," Gregory said, his voice steadier now that we had a concrete plan. "We should also schedule a joint interview with a major business publication to control the narrative." The board voted unanimously to approve the new leadership structure, though I noted the lingering questions in their eyes. The professional crisis had been temporarily contained, but the personal fallout remained to be addressed. As the meeting concluded and executives dispersed to execute their assigned tasks, Gregory and I found ourselves alone in the boardroom. The power dynamic between us had been irrevocably altered. No longer was I just his wife taking notes in the corner. I had revealed myself as Elise Waverly, founding investor and controlling shareholder of the company he had believed was his creation. "You know this changes everything," he said quietly, gathering his papers. "It already has," I replied. "The question is whether you can adapt to this new reality." His response would determine not just the future of our marriage, but whether Horizon Dynamics would thrive under its new dual leadership or fracture under the weight of its founder's personal conflict. The next 3 hours passed in a carefully choreographed dance of corporate communications, strategic planning, and market management. From the executive floor of Horizon Dynamics headquarters, we orchestrated the public revelation of both the Jensen acquisition and our new leadership structure. Catherine Reynolds had assembled a crisis management team in the main conference room, where monitors displayed real-time market reactions and media coverage. Gregory and I sat side by side at the head of the table, presenting a united front despite the tension humming between us. "CNBC is leading with the acquisition story," Catherine reported, gesturing toward the leftmost screen. "They're highlighting the combined patent portfolio as a game changer in neural interface technology. Bloomberg is focusing more on the SOAR leadership angle," Alexander noted, scrolling through his tablet. "They're calling it a strategic evolution but asking questions about the timing. Their technology correspondent is requesting a joint interview." I nodded. "Schedule it for tomorrow morning. We need time to align our messaging." Gregory's phone buzzed continuously with incoming calls and messages. Colleagues, competitors, and friends were undoubtedly reaching out for explanations about the woman they'd known as just his wife, suddenly being revealed as co-CEO and controlling shareholder. The press release had gone out at 10:15 a.m., carefully worded to present the changes as a planned strategic evolution. Horizon Dynamics announces the acquisition of Jensen Biomedical, creating the industry's leading neural interface technology portfolio. In conjunction with this expansion, the company is implementing its planned leadership evolution, with founders Gregory and Elise Harrington assuming co-CEO roles, leveraging their complementary expertise in operations and strategic finance, respectively. What wasn't mentioned, but would inevitably become clear to industry insiders, was that Elise Waverly Harrington had been the controlling shareholder all along, operating behind the scenes while her husband took public credit for the company's success. The market's responding positively, Samuel reported, studying the trading charts. Horizon's stock is up 12.4% since the announcement. Trading volume is 6 times normal. Jensen's locked at their acquisition price, Richard added. The arbitrage, traders are all over it, but the deal structure is solid. I watched the scrolling news tickers with measured satisfaction. The narrative was unfolding largely as I'd planned, though accelerated by market forces. What would normally have been executed over weeks had been compressed into hours, requiring real-time adjustments to our strategy. Arthur Jensen is giving a statement, Catherine said suddenly, turning up the volume on the Bloomberg feed. The silver-haired founder of Jensen Biomedical appeared on screen, standing before his company's Massachusetts research campus. The merger with Horizon Dynamics represents the best path forward for our technology, he stated to the assembled reporters. I've had extensive discussions with Elise Waverly Harrington over the past months and have complete confidence that the combined entity will accelerate the development of life-changing neural interface technologies. Gregory's head snapped toward me. You've been meeting with Arthur Jensen? For months? Since we identified the patent situation last fall, I confirmed quietly. We began discussing potential synergies in January. His jaw tightened, another piece of his perceived reality crumbling. Before he could respond, my phone rang with a call from Victoria Chen at Blackstone. Elise, she said when I answered, her voice carrying across the speakerphone. Masterful execution as always. The market is absolutely buzzing about the stealth CEO who's been hiding in plain sight. You're trending on Twitter, by the way. Not the exposure I'd planned, I replied dryly, but we're managing the narrative. The institutional investors are impressed, Victoria continued. They're viewing this as a strategic coup rather than a corporate drama. Your joint statement with Gregory was perfectly pitched. I glanced at my husband, whose expression remained carefully neutral despite the continued unraveling of his professional narrative. We'll speak more later, I told Victoria before ending the call. Samuel approached with a tablet displaying a real-time stock chart. We've stabilized around $87 per share, a 14% increase from opening. The market clearly approves of both the acquisition and the leadership announcement. The employees are another matter, Alexander added more quietly. The all-staff email went out 30 minutes ago. HR reports the internal messaging channels are exploding with questions. This was the aspect that concerned me most. How Horizon's 600 employees would process the revelation that the woman occasionally glimpsed at company events, introduced simply as Gregory's wife, was actually the founder and controlling shareholder. Schedule an all-hands meeting for 2 p.m., I decided. Gregory and I should address the staff directly, present a unified vision. Gregory nodded in agreement, his first independent contribution in the past hour. The research teams particularly need reassurance about the integration plan. Many have personal loyalty to me. The unspoken question hung in the air. Would that loyalty remain when they learned how he had systematically diminished his wife's role and expertise? Catherine approached with an update from the PR team. We've compiled the first wave of media inquiries. Most outlets are requesting background on Elise. They're framing this as a hidden founder story. Provide my Wellington bio and basic information about Waverly Holdings, I instructed, but decline personal interview requests for now. All communications should focus on the strategic benefits of the Jensen acquisition and our complementary leadership approach. As the team dispersed to execute their assignments, Gregory and I found ourselves momentarily isolated in the glass-walled conference room, surrounded by screens displaying the public dissection of our professional and personal relationship. "You've been planning this for months," he said quietly, his voice carrying no accusation, only a dawning recognition. "I've been preparing for various contingencies," I corrected. Last night's conversation accelerated the timeline. He met my gaze directly. "When you said I'd built my success on your ideas, I dismissed it as the bitter complaint of someone who didn't understand business realities. I never imagined that I might actually be right," I finished for him. "That just your wife might have the expertise you dismissed?" Before he could respond, Alexander returned with an urgent update. "The all-hands meeting has been moved up. Employees are gathering in the auditorium now, demanding answers. We need to address them immediately." The reckoning with our staff could no longer be delayed. It was time to face the people who had built their careers on a company narrative that had just been fundamentally rewritten. 6 months after the boardroom revelation, I stood at the window of my new corner office, watching the Boston skyline transition from afternoon gold to evening blue. The Wall Street Journal lay open on my desk, featuring Horizon Jensen's latest breakthrough in neural interface technology. Our stock price had tripled since the merger. A light knock at my door interrupted my reflection. Gregory stood in the doorway holding 2 coffee cups, a peace offering that had become our daily ritual. "Quarterly projections are finalized," he said, placing my cup on the desk. "We're exceeding targets by 22%. The Jensen integration team deserves most of the credit," I replied, accepting both the coffee and the professional courtesy. Their adaptive algorithms were years ahead of the competition. In the months since our leadership restructuring, we had settled into a cautious professional equilibrium. The co-CEO model had proven surprisingly effective, with Gregory overseeing operations while I directed strategy and innovation. The business press had transitioned from focusing on the hidden wife CEO scandal to analyzing our complementary leadership approach. "The 60-minute segment airs this Sunday," Gregory noted, referring to the profile CBS had produced on our unconventional leadership story. PR sent over the final cut for approval. "I've reviewed it," I said. They handled the narrative tactfully. What remained unspoken was how the personal aspect of our relationship had evolved. After the initial shock and media frenzy subsided, we had faced the painful reckoning of our marriage. Weeks of tense conversations and therapy sessions had led to an uncomfortable truth. Our personal relationship had been built on the same power imbalance that had characterized our professional one. Gregory leaned against the doorframe, studying me with the contemplative expression that had replaced his former confidence. "The Innovation Summit in Singapore next month? Are we both attending?" "I think we should," I replied. "The Asian expansion depends on presenting a unified front." The professional collaboration continued, even as our personal lives had diverged. 3 months after the revelation, Gregory had moved into the guest house on our Beacon Hill property, separate lives under nominally shared domesticity, an arrangement that provided privacy while avoiding public speculation about divorce. "Elise," he said, his tone shifting to something more personal, "I've been meaning to tell you. I'm stepping back from the CNBC appearances for a while. You should take the lead on media engagement." The admission represented significant evolution, from the man who had once proudly introduced me as just my wife to board members. While our marriage hadn't survived in its previous form, Gregory had demonstrated remarkable adaptability in our professional partnership. "Any particular reason?" I asked. "Your vision for the neural imaging applications is more compelling than mine," he admitted with hard-earned honesty. "The medical community responds better to your presentations." Such acknowledgement would have been unthinkable a year ago. Another sign of the transformation that had occurred not just in our company structure, but in Gregory himself. Catherine Reynolds appeared in the doorway behind him. "Sorry to interrupt, but the MIT research team is ready for your joint presentation downstairs." As we walked together toward the elevator, I reflected on the complex outcome of my revelation. The company had not only survived but thrived under our dual leadership. The power couple revolutionizing medical technology narrative had replaced the initial scandal, creating a corporate mythology that inspired rather than divided. The professional victory had been complete, but had come at personal cost. The marriage built on subtle inequities couldn't withstand the correction of those imbalances. Yet something unexpected had emerged from the ruins, a genuine professional respect that neither of us had anticipated. "Before we go in," Gregory said as we paused outside the presentation room, "I wanted you to know I've recommended Sophia Chen for the research director position at our Cambridge facility." I raised an eyebrow. Sophia had been one of the first female executives to approach me after my role was revealed, sharing stories of being overlooked despite her brilliant contributions. "She has the most innovative approach to the neural mapping." "Challenges," he continued, answering my unspoken question. "I've learned to recognize when someone's expertise exceeds my own in a particular area." The statement represented perhaps the most profound change, his willingness to acknowledge others' contributions without feeling threatened by them. As we entered the room filled with researchers eager to present their findings, I recognized that the revelation that had begun as an act of righteous anger had transformed into something more significant. Beyond personal vindication, it had created space for a more equitable organization where talent and contribution were recognized regardless of gender or title. "Ready to see the future?" Gregory asked as the presentation lights dimmed. "I always am," I replied, taking my seat beside him. No longer behind him, no longer invisible, but alongside as an acknowledged equal. The boardroom revelation had forced a painful but necessary correction of a power imbalance that extended far beyond our marriage. In exposing the truth that I wasn't just his wife, I had created ripples that continued to transform not just Horizon Jensen's corporate structure, but the culture itself. Sometimes, I reflected as the presentation began, the most powerful stories aren't about revenge, but about restoration, about claiming the recognition and respect that should have been there all along.